2020 was the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote nationally through a constitutional amendment, and Melanie and I were talking about how we might look at the local people and events that led up to that moment. Voting rights are established at a state level, and New York State granted women the right to vote 3 years earlier in a November 1917 referendum. When you look at the longer arc of progress, you see some women breaking barriers through pure, relentless political work, while at the same time you see women equally creating their own revolution by excelling in a field men preferred to keep to themselves. Both were equally effective in changing the landscape, but in different ways and involved persistence. So we came up with the idea that we would look at both the political voices of women and the talents of women that each in their own way created profound change through the lens and landscape of Dutchess County. I will take us through the political story, covering a period long enough that you end up with two distinct generations. The influence of two distinct communities are reflected in each generation. In the first generation of advocacy, our county's very large Quaker population had a disproportionate influence in populating the national debate with women who grew up in or were educated in Dutchess County. And in the second generation of advocacy, finally, formally unfettered and allowed to speak on the issue of suffrage, where it had been previously prohibited, Vassar College professors and students produced leaders that spoke and organized at a national, if not an international level, and leaders who spoke and organized at a city and town level across the county. Melody will take us through the example of Caroline Morgan Clowes. Miss Clowes was an exceptionally talented LaGrange artist whose friends and representatives in her early success did not correct perceptions among elite gallery owners that she was a man, as she went by the name C.M. Clowes. It's been an amazing journey to rediscover her talents in life with her family, the donor of a great many of her works and others. Her story is a very Dutchess County story, in that the majority of subjects she painted were Dutchess County subjects. And she was greatly influenced by a handful of exceptional men and women who had been drawn to Poughkeepsie as teachers in the city then known as the City of Schools, which came to include, of course, Vassar College in 1865, just as Clowes was maturing as an artist. On the political side, one of the most visible suffrage leaders, Carrie Chapman Catt, was in Poughkeepsie visiting Vassar College in 1938. She described the effort of women's suffrage as, quote, the struggle of a 72-year campaign won by the devoted capacity of many women to perform drudgery. And it really was that 72-year span from the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 to women gaining the right to vote nationally in 1920 that is the extraordinary long span of time we're looking at. We break it down into three sections, all through the lens of Dutchess County, in what I will call the first generation of advocacy, 1848 to 1880, from the Seneca Falls Convention to women gaining the right to vote in 1880 in New York State, in school elections only, a transitionary period between 1880 and 1900, and the intense run-up to success, 1900 to 1920. So let's start at the beginning, or even a bit before the beginning. I found it interesting that so much of the argument until the very last stages of resistance to women's suffrage argued that women were not built or prepared to be effective persons outside raising children and backing their husband. They didn't have the backbone. And yet in 1848, Victoria was 10 years into her reign as Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, a person who gave her name to an entire global era. And of course, centuries earlier, Queen Elizabeth I successfully fought family intrigue and foreign wars, achieving a 44-year reign and lending her name to an entire period of British history. And long prior to that, appropriately in Seneca Falls, one could look back much further. The Seneca native people were among the Iroquois Five Nations, where women had leadership roles as clan mothers or elders, and were equal partners to men in certain roles and superior in others. This is reflected in this cartoon at the time, with native women looking at the suffrage leaders saying, quote, we whom you pity as drudges reached centuries ago the goal that you are nearing. The commencement of the first period we examine is the Seneca Falls Convention, generally considered to be the starting point of the formal, organized effort of women gaining the right to vote. And the end is marked by a clear, albeit small, step toward victory when women gained the right to vote in New York State and school elections in 1880. There was some comfort in allowing women to be involved in decisions that related to children. And there were a lot of women who were paying property taxes and school taxes, and they argued successfully that this was taxation without representation. There were 5 organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention. While Elizabeth Cady Stanton was not a Quaker, the other 4 were, and each of the 4 Quakers had some tie to Dutchess County, either through its well-known 9 Partners boarding school or through family ties. In the 19th century, Dutchess County had the largest Quaker population outside of Philadelphia, so it was bound to have an influence in the larger national discussion. The 4 Seneca Fall organizers who were Quaker were Lucretia Coffin Mott and her sister, Martha Coffin Wright. The Coffin family was so established in Dutchess County, there was a hamlet named Coffin Summit near Millbrook, now Oak Summit. The other 2 Quakers were Mary McClintock and Jane Hunt. Around 1738, you find Quakers arriving in the county, in the constant pursuit of peace and remote space, in the eastern and central parts of the county that were the least settled. They were leaving Rhode Island, Nantucket, and Massachusetts to avoid conflict and find remoteness. The large Dutchess County Quaker population was involved in the abolitionist movement by being the earliest group to prohibit its members from owning slaves in the 18th century. Quakers shunned explicit public political engagement, but the principle of equal roles for women could be seen in Quakers' early acceptance of women preachers, the early embrace of equal opportunity in education, such as the 9 Partners boarding school in today's Millbrook that opened in 1796. But along came the Revolutionary War, and in Fishkill in southern Dutchess there emerges the major Revolutionary War military depot. And after the war, Quakers moved further north in the 19th century in pursuit of peace and peaceful space, as well as into the city of Poughkeepsie. It's worth noting these geographical shifts because you'll see the emergence of practical actions like women voting or trying to vote reflected in the geographical path of the Quakers. Even as the Quaker faith had its challenges, the most fundamental being a split in orthodoxy referred to as the Hicksite separation of 1827, women who were deeply imbued with Quaker values, whether they remained Quakers or not, stepped out to the larger world beyond Dutchess County and had an impact. It was at the 9 Partners boarding school that Lucretia Coffin, later Mott, was a student, then a teacher, and it was where she met her husband. She wrote later that the school had a profound influence on her values and worldview. In addition to the Quaker women who organized the Seneca Falls Convention, let me introduce you to a few others. The town of Milan's Julia Wilbur attended the 9 Partners boarding school. She was arguing for the equal pay of women teachers as early as 1857, specifically citing statistics that women were paid 1/2 or 1/3 of what men were paid for the exact same work. She moved to Virginia during the Civil War, where she was involved with the abolitionist cause and cared for sick and wounded. In 1869, she attempted to vote with 5 other women in Washington, D.C. Although unsuccessful, she gained visibility for her action. The town of Clinton's Elizabeth Powell Bond became Dean of Swarthmore College, a Quaker college, for 25 years. Along the way, she ran a boarding school that accepted African American and Catholic children. She studied under Diocletian Lewis, the inventor of the practice of physical culture, which evolved into our contemporary athletics and physical education regimes, and she became the first gymnastics instructor at Vassar College. Also from Clinton, the licensed Universalist preacher, the Reverend Amanda Deo. She was among only a handful of women in the country so licensed. Born into a Quaker family, she and her husband were licensed preachers in the Universalist Church, and together they led the Dutchess County Peace Society, which during its peak in the 1870s and 1880s brought together as many as 5,000 people at Wiley's Grove in Clinton. Melody will speak later about Mariah Mitchell, but I'll mention here that her activities perfectly reflect what Vassar College expected of its professors at the time and for generations after. As founder of the American Association for the Advancement of Women, becoming its president in 1874, the group's aims were to, quote, secure higher intellectual, moral, and physical conditions for women, thereby improving all domestic and social relations. No mention of politics. While Mitchell may have been expected to limit her own speech, that did not prevent her from inviting outspoken individuals to her famous observatory. In April of 1868, Mitchell invited Anna Dickinson, a nationally known suffrage advocate, who was famous for her talk, Idiots and Women, an unapologetic argument for women's suffrage, ridiculing the pairing of these two conditions that prohibited the right to vote in New York State. After the talk, Matthew Vassar offered generally supportive comments in a private letter. While I'm not sure how much to read into this, he had been in the observatory in advance of the talk and specifically left before Dickinson arrived. It's also worth mentioning the Methodists, who operated an important and highly regarded school, the Armenian Seminary. From local Methodists emerged the first women preachers. Katie Lent was born in Columbia County, the daughter of a preacher, Marvin Lent, who served as Methodist minister in Beacon and many other Dutchess County locations like Pine Plains. She attended the Armenian Seminary and then attended Boston University School of Theology. She became a licensed preacher in the Methodist Church in a vote by the Poughkeepsie District in 1878 that was held in the Washington Street Methodist Church shown here. However, the license was revoked 2 years later by the National Methodist Conference. As a result, Miss Lent focused her energies on the Women's Christian Temperance Union, becoming internationally known after marriage as Catherine Lent Stevenson. She's best known for having written the song One Fine Day that remains an anthem of the WCTU to this day. She was a world ambassador and visited Hawaii, Japan, China, Australia, New Zealand, India, Burma, Ceylon, Egypt, Palestine, Greece, and Italy. Imagine what it was like to travel those distances in those days. Meet the woman known as Widow Van Cott. In the April 1869 New York Times, she was heralded as, quote, the only licensed female Methodist preacher in the country. The dateline of the article is the hamlet of Madeline in Red Hook in northern Dutchess, where she was having enormous success in conversions. From Ulster County, but very active in Dutchess for decades, she was breaking barriers and expectations of men's and women's roles. Looking at Anna Howard Shaw, although living in Michigan initially and not local, you'll see a familiar pattern. She attended the Boston University Theological Seminary with a view to being ordained in the Methodist Episcopal Church. Denied ordination as a woman, she became a preacher in the breakaway Methodist Protestant Church, but became better known first in a leadership role at the WCTU, and then best known for her suffrage work with Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt. She shows up in our third segment after 1900. A victory of sorts was achieved when women got the right to vote in New York State for school elections only. There was a feeling that women's thinking and approach to school matters and the education of young children were a strength and perhaps even a distinct advantage over men. This is what happened in Dutchess County. School teachers at the time, like Miss Sitzer and Milan shown here, were entrusted to teach children as long as they remain unmarried. This special association of women with children, when combined with the harder argument that women like Marietta Frost and Emma Gasley in the town of Clinton paid school taxes and deserved representation. This ultimately is what resulted in the 1880 right to vote in school elections. In 1880, there appear to have been only a handful of instances of women voting in the county. Stanford's election of a school trustee involved a male candidate advocating for more equal treatment of women. Despite good turnout, he was defeated. Coffin Summit in Millbrook, named for the Quaker family of Lucretia Coffin Mott, saw a woman nominated to be school trustee and 6 women voted, but the female candidate lost. In Arlington, 6 women voted. Most seem to have been students at Vassar College, among them a Miss Wheeler who was said to have attended with her parents. Women did not vote or even try to vote in Poughkeepsie as they were denied registration. 3 wards in Poughkeepsie reported activity prior to the election when they tried to register to vote. In Ward 5, a Mrs. Welton was refused. In Ward 6, two unnamed women were refused. And in Ward 3, Helen Loder, Miriam Culver-Mosier, and Mary Mott all tried to register but were rebuffed. The breakthrough came in Union Vale, which elected a woman school district clerk. Nancy Boyd Duncan was a school teacher in Dover and the daughter of Irish immigrants. If you look at many of the women who had stepped forward as local candidates in subsequent decades, a good number, more than half, are daughters of Irish immigrants. You'll also note she's a mother of 5 young children. I had mentioned Helen Loder. She was a woman ahead of her time, and that during this period it was unusual to have working-class women emerging so publicly in the advocacy of suffrage. She was a daughter of Irish immigrants. Her husband was a freight handler for the railroad. They lived adjacent to the railroad tracks on North Hamilton Street. Loder was active as a speaker, journalist, organizational member, voter, and candidate. She's so active she ends up on the ticket in supporting Bella Lockwood for president in 1884, a largely ceremonial attempt, but very visible. Helen Loder died in 1903, and this is where you clearly see the gap in generations. Her obituary in the Poughkeepsie paper reads, Helen Loder, formerly of Poughkeepsie, died at her home on Long Island Sunday after a brief illness. She was at one time a very prominent temperance worker in Poughkeepsie and took an active part in the women's suffrage movement, at one time holding the position of state secretary. The interim period is a time when there were visible expressions of what was called the New Woman. The New Woman had opinions of her own and asserted herself. She was frequently the butt of jokes and derision, and she came to be strongly associated with the bicycle. Taking advantage of this growing association, the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, Frances Willard, wrote a book called How I Learned to Ride the Bicycle, which frankly reads, How I Learned to Be Independent. The bicycle not only demonstrated independence, but illuminated the values of unencumbered clothing and physical exercise and fitness. You see a wonderful series of photos showing her struggling to learn how to ride the bicycle, initially with the assistance of men, until at last, with the words literally at last under the photo, she's often on her way with a gentleman, perhaps her husband, left back in the dust. We had a contest on Facebook seeking old images of our grandmothers and great-grandmothers on bicycles from the period. My favorite is from Jean Gard of Poughkeepsie, the one in the middle. She gave us the photo of her great-grandmother looking like a very determined bicyclist. In this period, you find increased national conversations about dress reform and physical education and activity. Although bloomers were introduced in the 1850s, and you'll recall that Elizabeth Powell Bond was teaching gymnastics at Vassar College in 1868. It was during this period between 1880 and 1900 there grew a bigger discussion about these issues. In 1890, Mabel Janess spoke about comprehensive physical culture. Physical culture, this was the language of Diocletian Lewis, referenced earlier. She spoke at the Vassar Institute on Vassar Street, now part of Cooneen Hackett Center. And then you have this last leg between 1900 and 1920, and really even within that, the last decade. Here we see Vassar professor Laura Wiley, a perfect example of the new freedom Vassar professors had in speaking out, who after leading a successful political effort upon getting the right to vote, set up and led the leading social reform group. A 1915 New York State referendum failed, but 2 years later, a November 1917 referendum passed, and women of New York State gained the right of vote to equal to men. This was a time when women who were very visible in the suffrage movement pivoted to fully and visibly support the war effort once the U.S. declared war on Germany in April of 1917. There's no doubt that the dramatic and visible role of women in World War I helped push the referendum over the edge into yes. If we look at the run-up to the finish line, there's an indication of things to come in 1901. Remember Anna Shaw? She's older now. She held a suffrage rally in Poughkeepsie in 1901. And although it would take until 1910 for things to really crystallize locally, with the formation of the Equal Suffrage League, this was a harbinger and an indication of things to come. Laura Wiley, pictured on the left, was a founder and leader of the Equal Suffrage League from 1910. She lived off campus in this house with her partner, also a Vassar professor, Gertrude Buck. Even on campus in 1912, Vassar College President Taylor reluctantly agreed to rescind the ban on suffrage activities on campus. He retired 3 years later, and the much more supportive Henry Noble McCracken became president, ushering in a new era of visibility on the topic. As the 1915 New York State referendum on women's suffrage approached, the decade from 1910 showed an increasing unity and breadth of engagement across all social groups that had not happened prior. Obviously, Vassar College voices were important and recruited through Wiley's leadership. The elite women of the county were very involved. Women like Ruth Morgan, Margaret Chandler Aldrich, Margaret Lewis Morgan Norrie, and Amy Spingarn. They all had very visible national and local roles. They were equally comfortable in a White House meeting or rally in the basement of a Grange Hall locally. Again, prior to television and radio, the average farmer or factory worker was reached through the mass medium of the time, pageants and parades. As a precursor to the large national 1913 march in Washington, D.C., in December of 1912, General Rosalie Jones led a parade of pilgrims from New York City to Albany to petition the governor on suffrage, making 5 overnight stops in Dutchess County, persevering through cold and dark and snow. Amy and Joel Spingarn at their Troutbeck estate in Amelia held field days, which in 1912 and 1913 held suffrage pageants. Field days were a progressive idea at the time to create a positive climate to retain and grow local farmers and well-informed citizens, often led by elites like the Spingarns. Here we see the Dutchess County Suffrage Association at Amelia Field Day. There was a special outreach from the Equal Suffrage League to African Americans through the Smith AME Zion Church in Poughkeepsie, seeking black men's vote on the upcoming 1915 referendum. A parishioner known for her poetry at the time, Sadie Peterson, read a poem she wrote entitled The Suffrage Call. She went on to international fame as the head librarian at Tuskegee Veterans Hospital. She crafted a practice known as bibliotherapy, again prior to the consoling a role of TVs and radios in hospital rooms. She carefully crafted reading to help returning veterans heal from physical and mental injury. As the surge in support for women's suffrage was emerging across all social classes, finally at Vassar College, a transfer of administration to a more progressive and open approach formally took place when President Taylor retired and Henry Noble McCracken began what would become a 3-decade tenure. Despite all this, in 1915, a referendum on women's suffrage failed in New York State. Again, the little areas of support that you did have tended to be the Quaker areas and the emerging several election districts in the more factory-oriented Beacon. But 57 election districts failed to get a majority, and only 11 districts achieved this majority. It really was World War I that became the final tipping point. Given the need for women to replace men, who were in large numbers heading off to war in France and bases and camps in the U.S., the essential need allowed women to step into unprecedented roles like farm and factory workers. We saw young women on tractors and farming as farmerettes. We saw women on trolley lines becoming conductors in Poughkeepsie. Factories started to employ women where they hadn't before. Using the language of the time, colored women were given local work in factories as well. The Common Council voted in favor of a policewoman. Many women who were visible in the suffrage movement became very visible contributors to the war effort, without losing the opportunity to make a tie between the two movements. Nina McCullough Mattern was one such woman. When the governor of New York first announced the creation of a system of county-level defense councils to report to him, he only later made the suggestion that these county-level councils have women. with a suggestion that they be drawn from the National League for Women's Service and the Women's Suffrage Party. This ended up being translated by the county defense councils to local requests that every city and town create defense councils that have at least one woman. So in November of 1917, we find Dutchess County still saying no to women's suffrage, but at a state level, which is all that matters, there is a yes. While not reaching a majority in the county, you can see a much broader spread of election districts that voted yes, and this shows the pattern of support emerging from the nascent 1880 school elections to the 1915 failed referendum to 1917, which, while failing at a county level, did succeed at a state level. Of the 12 women who ran for a local office in Dutchess County in 1919, the first year they were able to do so beyond school elections, one woman did not succeed in her primary fight. 8 women got their party's endorsement but lost the election, and 2 were unopposed in the election and of course won. This leaves Anna Roselle as the first woman to win a competitive election. She won the Republican Party nomination for Town of Clinton Overseer of the Poor, and then beat her Democratic opponent 416 to 259. In 1941, speaking after teaching for 25 years, she told a story of being offered a teaching position in the Salt Point School after her oldest son had been a teacher there. They offered her less salary despite her years of experience relative to a man with virtually none. Remember Julia Wilbur lobbying on this topic in 1857. She got the higher salary when she demanded it, and she'd go on to be the first woman leader of her local Grange. She worked at WKIP until 1960, where she won the admiration of her colleagues when she retired. This later information is courtesy of her family. 2 organizations, the Women's City and County Club and the League of Women Voters, emerge as long-standing, effective organizations, the latter, of course, still active today. On the left is a program of activities from 1921 and 22 related to the club, and on the right, a history of the local League of Women Voters by Ellie Charwat and Nancy Fogel. You'll find both on our website. So to summarize, the 72-year-long battle involved persistence across 2 generations. It saw the gradual and eventual convergence of advocacy from a wide range of social groups in the county. And for New York, at least, World War I and the emergence of successful women in vital roles in the national interest in defense of freedom pushed the argument to a successful conclusion a few years ahead of the national resolution.
Bill has revealed the many women of Dutchess who successfully used their voices to push for greater rights for women, and specifically the right to vote. I'd like to end our program by turning our attention to the second part of the 2020 theme, Women's Talents, and specifically the talent of one woman of Dutchess County, Caroline Morgan Clowes. 19 of her paintings, dozens of her sketches, and hundreds of letters were gifted to the Society in 2019, and we, working with historians, art historians, appraisers, and family members, have come to believe that she was one of, if not the best, animal painter in America of her time. Here are a few examples of her wonderful paintings. And I think you'll see as we scroll through them, the sort of richness of her palette, her ability to portray animals in a wonderfully unique way. Sheep, I think, coming up are one of her favorite subjects, and they're done so well that you almost feel you can reach out and run your fingers through the fleece and feel the lanolin in them. She also did some lovely small-scale paintings of birds and ducks and chickens. So she had a very wide range of animal subjects, as I think you've seen depicted in these few paintings we've shown you. Beginning in 2012, as we see here, the Historical Society was the recipient of this enormous collection of materials related to the Hart-Hubbard family of LaGrange. In 1838, the Hart family moved from Long Island to Dutchess County and established an apple orchard and business that would continue for over 125 years. The thousands of documents that you saw in the preceding photograph detail not only their business life, but their personal life as well. The same year that Benjamin and Elizabeth Hart came to Overlook Road in the town of LaGrange, Benjamin's sister Elizabeth, Ann Clowes, shown here, gave birth on Long Island to her second daughter, Caroline. Her first child, Lydia, shown here on the left, had been born 2 years earlier in 1836. It was 2 years later, on October 19, 1840, that Caroline's mother gave birth to another daughter, Ellen. Sadly, Elizabeth Clowes only survived her daughter's birth by 2 months, and on Christmas Eve, 1840, she died, following at least 2 years of wasting away with consumption. On her deathbed, she wrote out her burial wishes and penned parting letters to each of her 3 daughters. Still more sorrow followed when on October 10, 1841, baby Ellen, not quite a year old, also passed away. Caroline and her older sister Lydia were left motherless, to be cared for by their father, William Jones Clowes. Records suggest that William was at best a distracted father, fanatically interested in mathematical theories that he felt could bridge the gap between faith and science. Here are just a very few images from his extensive notebooks that will give you a sense of how his mind worked. And some of these images are just beyond comprehension in terms of my mind, but he was consumed with these theories. And as I said, there are, hundreds of documents that he's laid out in this minute handwriting to try and prove to himself, and I suppose the world, his theories. Such being the case, he was ill-equipped to find a way to ensure the financial security of his daughters. We have hundreds upon hundreds of his letters, most focused on ideas that were then and now barely understandable. By 1851, it was clear to extended family members that something had to be done about Lydia and Caroline, who were now 15 and 13 respectively, and virtual, if not true, orphans. Here in this story is where fate plays a hand. While we don't know the specifics about how the decision was made, we do know that it was decided that the sisters would be split up and each would go to live with family members. Lydia to her Aunt Lizzie, sometimes called Betsy, and her husband, the Reverend Reuben Lindsay Coleman, who were living in Virginia. And Caroline to her mother's brother, Benjamin Hall Hart, and his wife Elizabeth of LaGrange. And we've met them earlier in our story. The two households could not have been more different. Mrs. Coleman, now Lydia's foster mother, was only 12 years older than Lydia herself. Her husband was 16 years her elder. The Reverend and Mrs. Coleman had only been married 5 years when Lydia moved in with them. And by the time that Lydia arrived, the Colemans had 3 children under the age of 5. It is easy to think that Lydia was more household help than daughter. Eventually, the Colemans would have 8 children of their own, and in none of the genealogies or family histories online is there a mention of Lydia being a member of the household. Records do reveal that Betsy, Mrs. Coleman, had been sent to live with the Clowes family when her Aunt Elizabeth was dying, and at that time she formed a close bond with Lydia and Caroline. gods, however, were working in Caroline's favor. Heartsease, as the home in LaGrange was called, was given a blessing by the boss carpenter when construction was completed in 1839. Peace and plenty, always full and never empty. And so it was. Generation after generation of family members came to live at Heartsease, some for a short time, and others, like Caroline, the short lady on the right, for her entire life. Whereas the Christmas season might previously have been a reminder of her mother's death, Christmas of 1851, her first at Heartsease, found Caroline in a whole new world. One of her gifts that year was 5 drawing books from her Aunt Adelia Nichols, who also lived at Heartsease. Caroline wrote to her sister Lydia about the books, from which I hope I will soon learn to draw well. It seems such a small gift, but in a way, it was also Caroline's rebirth in a loving household where her talent was recognized and nurtured. Among the earliest pencil sketches in the collection is this one, dated 1853. Clearly, her 1851 Christmas wish was being realized. She was indeed learning to draw well. Her more formal training began at the Poughkeepsie Female Academy, located at 12 Cannon Street. Opened in 1837, the school was considered a first-class school in every sense. The course of study there included all the basics of the time: Latin and French, geology, algebra, penmanship and elocution, and others maybe not so basic, the evidences of Christianity, the etymology of words and their prefixes and suffixes, and mental philosophy. Among the optional courses that attracted Caroline were drawing, pencil, crayon, painting in watercolors or oils, and sketching from nature. The walk from Overlook Road, depending on the route, was at least 5 miles one way and would easily have taken her an hour and a quarter to get there. There is additional evidence that she took lessons from Samuel F.B. Morse. For at least 3 years, from 1862 to 1865, we know that Caroline studied with Frederick Rondell. Paris-born and trained, Rondell was lured to Poughkeepsie by Matthew Vassar to paint documentary pictures of his 3 ancestral homes. On February 10, 1862, Rondell took out a newspaper ad announcing the opening of his studio for ladies at his residence on Mansion Square, the corner of Clinton Street. He was also a professor of painting at the Cottage Hill Academy. Beyond his role as an art instructor, Rondell became a friend and a mentor to Caroline, advising her not only on her art, but also on the business side of her career. An 1865 entry in her cousin Edmund Hart's diary recounts a chance meeting with Mr. Rondell in Farnham's drugstore, where Rondell was profuse in his expression of admiration of Carrie's artistic efforts. He predicts a brilliant reputation for her in a very few years if she only labors as assiduously in the cultivation of her talents as she has done. Hart also recorded that Rondell brought his students to painting parties along the Wappingers Creek at Heartsease. Another great influence on her development as an artist was a group of people brought to Poughkeepsie by Matthew Vassar for his great experiment, a college dedicated to the higher education of women. Although Caroline was never formally enrolled as a student at the college, she somehow became enmeshed in the culture of the institution and formed a close circle of friends, teachers, and mentors from those associated with Vassar, and attended dozens of college programs and events as evidenced by invitations and programs. Dutchman Henry van Ingen was hired as the college's first professor of art and art history. Educated in The Hague, he had specialized in landscape painting. Van Ingen was known for leading students out of the classroom to sketch nature. How Caroline came to know him is unknown, but they became friends, and he encouraged her and advised her, and in 1878 purchased her painting, Contentment, for the art collection being developed at the college, promising his students to meet Miss Clowes, the artist. And here we see a close-up of Contentment, and we see it displayed in exhibit space at the college. One of the more unusual friendships that Caroline formed at Vassar College was the one she established with Maria Mitchell, who we met earlier. Appointed in 1865 to be included in the original 9-member faculty, Maria and her widowed father took up residence in the observatory, the first building completed on campus. Again, there is no documentation as to how the two women became friends, but they were close enough that the unmarried Mitchell felt comfortable encouraging Caroline to meet Chester Arthur. Mitchell wrote to Caroline, "He was well born, is well trained, sufficiently educated, and very efficient, is remarkably handsome. I think your domestic happiness will be perfect, as his tastes are aristocratic. It will be best for you to come for him with a carriage. Feed him well and make much of him, and he will not stray." One presumes it wasn't the Chester Arthur, but in any event, the matchmaking didn't work out, as Caroline, like Maria, remained unmarried throughout her life. The late 1860s through the 1870s finds Caroline in her most productive and prolific years as an artist. Dozens of letters from Archibald Wilson, bookseller and stationer at 295 Main Street in Poughkeepsie, just off to the right of this photograph, not visible here, report on sales of her pictures. Sold the Cosette for $250 without frame to Dr. Beadle of the city. April 1873, sold The Investigation for $400 with a new frame. Considerable amounts of money for the time. 1876, sold The Lambs to John P. Adriance for $70. In the summer of 1872, her uncle Benjamin recognized her successful career by creating a studio for her at Heartsease. Happily, that studio still stands today and has been restored by descendants of the original family who still live at Heartsease today. The crowning achievement of her career was her selection as one of the exhibitors in the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. Considered one of the signal cultural events in mid-19th century America, her painting, Cattle at the Brook, hung not in the women's gallery, but in the main gallery, with the likes of such prominent artists as John Lafarge, Sanford Gifford, Jervis McAtee, and Albert Bierstadt. These gentlemen you see in front of you now. This view of the main gallery shows her painting's placement in the style of installation common for the period. And where this is located was called skying or skied. With national acceptance accomplished, Caroline became a local leader in the art world, and in 1882, along with her friend Henry Van Ingen, artist James Smiley, and sculptor George Bissell, she was selected to be on the exhibition committee for the first art show at the recently completed Vassar Brothers Institute. 167 paintings were exhibited in 7 galleries throughout 3 floors of the building. 30 paintings were displayed in the South Room on the first floor in a fashion, we presume, that was very similar to that of the main gallery of the Centennial Exhibition. Caroline herself had 5 paintings in the exhibition along with those done by her friends and mentors, Benningen and Rondell. Among other noted artists of the day shown in the exhibit were Lily M. Spencer, Frederick Church, Jasper Cropsey, Smiley Brothers, and Sanford Gifford. Many of the paintings were loaned by the elite of Poughkeepsie: J.F. Winslow, George Innes, J.P. Adriance, W.H. Talmadge, and Mrs. Samuel F.B. Morse. An 1881 newspaper clipping found in Caroline's purse suggests she was confident in the choices she had made for herself over the past 3 decades, feeling that a woman's place is the one she can fill. While the Centennial Exposition was a great moment in American art, it was at the same time a period of great tension in the East Coast art community. A confrontation between New York landscape painters who supported native training and the figure painters of Philadelphia and Boston who advocated European study. Ultimately, the latter would prevail, and Caroline and others like her would fall from favor, and quite likely the commercial success she once enjoyed would diminish. While the first years of Caroline's life can be described as a time of turmoil and tribulation, the last years, happily, were lived out in contentment, surrounded by the extended family that had, from her early teens, provided her with love, encouragement, and stability. Following the Civil War, 2 of Caroline's cousins, Ambrose and Walter, both veterans of the Civil War, persuaded their father to purchase land in Florida where they would soon build homes and establish orange groves. Eventually, 4 of the Hart siblings would make Federal Point, Florida, their primary residence. Caroline, too, purchased land there and went on to establish her own working orange groves. By 1869, she had established a studio for herself and took up painting the animals and the landscape of her Florida backyard. For nearly the next 3 decades, Caroline's life and her paintings revolved around both Heartsease and LaGrange and 3 Oaks in Federal Point, Florida. The 1900 census reveals that 3 of the 7 Hart children were back living at Heartsease, and so was Caroline, and she remained there until her death on November 16, 1904. At some point, precise date unknown, her sister Lydia also came to live at Heartsease and was there to care for Caroline in her last days, during which time Lydia remarked that they learned to know each other better than ever before. Caroline was buried in the family plot in LaGrange alongside her father, who had died in 1897. 27 years later, in 1931, Lydia was laid to rest beside them. In 1859, Lydia wrote to Caroline and said, "You say you are wedded to your easel," and so it seems she was. Fulfilling the promise she made to herself to learn to draw well, she mastered her craft and left behind an incredible body of work that attests to the quality of women artists of the time, who were often overlooked and marginalized, choosing to sign their paintings with their initials instead of their full names so as not to reveal their sex. A February 1870 letter from J.H. Wright, an associate of Caroline's, confirms that this was true in her case. Speaking of Goupil's, a Philadelphia gallery and a painting supply store, Wright says, "They suppose that you are a gentleman, and I did not inform them. They predict a brilliant future for you. When your reputation is thoroughly established, I shall claim the pleasure to introduce you to them and enjoy the fun to see them open their astonished eyes." Family records indicate that Evensong, shown here, may be the last painting she completed before she died in 1904. For me, there's something comforting about the sheep finding safe shelter in the upended roots of the great tree. much like Caroline had found her safe shelter at Heartsease. We've restored her paintings. The job ahead is to restore her legacy. And while the exhibition of her work that we had planned for 2020 was canceled due to COVID, we look forward to doing that as soon as we can safely do so. And we believe that that will firmly establish her place in the world of 19th century American art. Thank you very much for your attention.